From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for all coming here. I'm Chris Murphy. I'm head of the Near East section here in the African Middle Eastern Division, one of the three sections. The focus of the section is to develop the collection and provide reference in the area broadly defined as the Near East, which in our case reaches from Xinjiang in China to Morocco, and from Kazan in Russia down into the Sudan. To that end, we have a number of specialists and reference librarians who do the work to make sure that our collections are adequate for the use of Congress, the federal bureaucracy, and the international scholarly public. And they also provide the consultation and access. And one of our Arab World specialists, in fact, our senior Arab World specialist, Dr. Fawzi Tadros, I will now ask him to introduce our speaker. Before Fawzi makes the introduction, I would like to point out that one of our missions, as a division and as a section, are to make the cultures for which we have responsibility to document better known to the general public in these presentations, which are often filmed and then mounted on the library website, where I encourage you to see other presentations that have been made here in the reading room. So without further ado, Fawzi. Excuse me, pardon.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure today to welcome all of you here to listen to our speaker on a very interesting subject, cuisine and culture in the Arab world. Our speaker, Ms. Amy Riolo, graduated from Cornell University. She has experience in vocational, recreational, and children instruction, as well as corporate team building and cultural culinary events. Her knowledge of the Italian, French, Spanish, and Arabic language has enabled her to interpret many cultures and cuisines with intimacy and ease. Amy's popular lectures range in topics and include everything from the Middle Eastern business etiquette to the history of various cuisines. She has been an invited guest speaker for the Smithsonian Institution, the National Museum of African Art, the Walters Art Museum, the Kennedy Center, the Embassy of the Arab Republic of Egypt, and the Embassy of Yemen, and others. Amy Riolo is an internationally recognized culinary expert specialized in Middle Eastern and Mediterranean culture and cuisine. As an award-winning author, lecturer, food historian, food writer, culinary consultant, and cooking instructor, Amy promotes her philosophy of cooking and living with pleasure and health. Her first book, Arabian Delight, Recipes and Princely Entertaining Ideas from the Arabian Peninsula, has received rave reviews. Her second book, Nile Style, Egyptian Cuisine and Culture, won the World Gourmet Award for Best Arab Cuisine Book in the USA in 2009. She also completed the Mediterranean Diet Book Cook. Amy is based in the Washington, D.C. area and leads culinary tours to both Mediterranean and the Middle East. Before I invite our speaker, I would like to thank my colleague Laverne Page, who introduced Amy to me. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Amy Riolo.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Ms. Deeb and Mr. Todras, Mr. Murphy, and Ms. Page for welcoming me and for having me here today. It's really an honor to be among you. So I would like to speak about the cuisine and culture of the Arab world today. And when I talk about the Arab world, you know, it encompasses 21 countries, and so many people think about hummus and kebabs. So today, hopefully, we'll learn a lot and expand our repertoire no matter where you're from, so that you'll be able to identify the differences between the different cultures. I would like to define the cuisine of the Levant, the Arabian Peninsula, and North Africa. We'll speak about those three different regions as we talk about the Arab world. We'll also discuss the role of geography in the cuisine of the region. We'll review culinary history, and we'll learn about the variations in Middle Eastern cuisine. There's a saying in Arabic that the food equals the affection. And this general proverb really takes place no matter where you are, whether you're in Morocco or Syria or the country of Oman. More is always better. Let's talk a little bit about the Fertile Crescent. This is sometimes what is referred to as the Levant region: Syria, Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq. And this area really refers to the half-moon crescent-shaped area where the Near Eastern civilizations thrived. And many of the commercial, religious, culinary, and other ideas were exchanged. Because there was a similar geography and a lot of similar trade routes going through, this region tends to be lumped together many different times throughout history. Now in modernity, here in the United States, in Brazil, in Europe, we have a lot of Lebanese restaurants due to so many expatriates from Lebanon. There are more Lebanese people living outside of Lebanon than there are in Lebanon, and many of them became wonderful restaurateurs. So over the years, they became great culinary ambassadors, and a lot of us think of Lebanese food when we think of Arab food or Middle Eastern food. And we'll discuss a little bit more about the Lebanese traditions throughout the presentation. We also have Egypt and Sudan. In this area, geographically being close and because of the Nile, they have many similar traits that they share. We also have an area that's known as the Maghreb. And the Maghreb refers to what we know as Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. Maghreb in Arabic means where the sun sets. It's the furthest place towards the west. So this is a whole region that was lumped together before the national boundaries that we define nowadays. This area had many, many things in common. Maghreb cuisine is a mix of Berber. Berber is nowadays called Amazigh because the term Berber was given to the tribes in Morocco by the Romans who were not able to conquer them. So they gave them the name barbarians, and barbarians became known as Berber. So nowadays it's much more politically correct to use the word Amazigh, which means free people, and refers to the indigenous tribes that were in Morocco in antiquity. They have Roman roots, Arab, Spanish, Jewish and Muslim, British, and also French influences. Here's a map of the Arabian Peninsula today, which is the easternmost region of the Arab world. And we can see Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman. In antiquity, the Arabian Peninsula was very, very important for its cuisine and for its wealth and for its trade routes because of incense. And so many of us, when we think of incense, we think, okay, that seems like a very superficial product. What does that have to do with food? Well, it has a lot to do with food because incense was actually used as a culinary ingredient. Natural incense can be in the form of a resin, like a gum mastic that they use in Greece and in Crete in this area. There are many natural ones that were used in the Arabian Peninsula. Even frankincense, for example, was a natural resin that could be used in food. And they would add a little piece of it to stews and things like this, just as you would add a spice. So it was very, very important. It was a widely available ingredient in this area, so people could use it. Another thing that they did was they would place an incense decanter next to a pitcher or next to a pot, and they would place a muslin cloth over it and let all of those aromas from the incense be absorbed into the pitcher. So if you were making a lemonade or something like this and you put a muslin cloth over it, it would get infused with that wonderful aroma of the incense. So this notion of fragrance and perfumes and things that we modernly think of as just an fragrance or an adornment were actually used as culinary ingredients in this time. And incense was so important to the ancient world. It was used since 6000 BC as a perfume, as well as for medicinal and religious purposes. And also in the Arabian Peninsula, this was the home or kind of the ground zero of what was known as the Incense Trail. And these trade routes really took place for more than 2,400 miles, and they sprouted out from the Arabian Peninsula. So many of us, when we think of this region, we think, oh, it's desert, it was isolated in antiquity, but it wasn't. Whole caravans were going out. They were going out into Africa and up into the Near East and spreading this incense all around. Incense was prized and valued at this time more than gold was. Both frankincense and myrrh were important. And the reason why they were important together is because they had counter-attractive properties. For example, frankincense was known to bring people up and to elevate their moods, and myrrh was known to bring them down and kind of relax people and ground people. So you had to have them in equal proportions in order to have a balanced environment. And of course, we know that those days sanitation wasn't the way that it is now, so people needed a lot of perfume and aroma in the area. But the emperors also used it a lot, and the wealthy used it a lot. And I believe that frankincense was kind of the Prozac of antiquity, because we know it enhances your mood. We know it invokes kind of a euphoria. And they would export it, especially into Rome, in tons. And this had to do with the way that people really lived in those days, and something that they could see to enhance their own personal moods as well as public safety. Now the land, as we talked about a little bit before the 20th century, a lot of the boundaries weren't the same. So nowadays people will say, well, this dish isn't Syrian, it's Lebanese, or this dish isn't Southern Egyptian, it's Sudanese. That's because we didn't have the national boundaries that we did nowadays. So those two dishes may have been very important at the same time in what we now consider to be different places. Maybe at one time they were under the same caliphate, or they were under the same empire. So this is why they were important to both cuisines. Classes and geographic locations really mattered more in antiquity than what we see as national boundaries nowadays. Now there's something unique again that we see taking place in Lebanon, which links it a little bit more towards the European culinary traditions, and that is the idea of villages and agricultural centers. In ancient Lebanon, and in the very beginning up until about the 7th century, the villages were kind of the epicenters of the communities, and they were where the agriculture was based. Classical feudalism existed in Lebanon, just like it did in Europe, which was a little different from the rest of the Arab world. So the land was divided into fiefs, and the feudal landlords lived among their peasants and enjoyed the same bounty, which is very different than we see in the rest of the Arab world. And these feudal principalities became known in the mountains, and a lot of these culinary traditions are preserved all the way until today in mountainous regions in Lebanon. Farmers learned to do things like preserve food, make it last all around the year, and of course they had to eat locally. Now we have in the Arabian Peninsula and in many parts of the Arab world the notion of Bedouins. Bedouins are very important in Arab culinary history because they laid down that kind of foundation that we all attribute the Middle Eastern cuisine with today. We think of lamb, we think of rice, we think of yogurt. These were things that the Bedouins had, and these were things that the Bedouins carried with them. So regardless of whether they were from Morocco or Syria or Iraq or Saudi Arabia, they would be eating very similar types of food and carrying it with them. Lamb and the idea of meat being very sacred and very important in the Arab world also stems from the times of the Bedouins. And that's because if you had an animal and you were traveling across terrain with it, you couldn't afford to sacrifice it and eat it, a portion of it, every day. There was no way to preserve the leftovers. There was no way to make it last. And then you were down an animal. And so, you're significantly down on your dairy supply. So those animals were really kept for their dairy supply. And on a daily basis, people would eat milk that came from the camels and the sheep. They would also take that milk and make it into yogurt. They would take the yogurt and make it into cheese. And they would supplement that with dates and with bread and with other things that they got along the way or that they traded with other people. That was the daily staple. But one of the things that they would do when they would honor guests, whether they had a large festival, a marriage, a ceremony, they would be able to slaughter an animal and to offer that to their guests because that animal was going to be eaten once and for all among the masses and among everybody. So having this animal became a sign of hospitality, and it really showed the affection towards the guest was to be offered this animal. This idea still prevails today in the Arab world. No matter whether there are 75 different dishes on the table, people are going to talk about which kinds of meat, and that meat will become kind of the centerpiece. The more important you are as a guest, the more meat you're offered. And so this is a very, very important backbone to the world of Arab cuisine. Here is a textile that shows in Palestine and in Jordan a traditional dish named Mansaf being made. And Mansaf is a layered dish that would have rice and also meat in it, usually lamb meat. Sometimes it was adorned with something that we call Arabic desert truffles, which grow up by themselves in the desert. It's similar to our potatoes. Here we have a typical breakfast, and this is something that you can see. It's sort of like a pizza, and it has za'atar on top. It's called manakish. This is a very traditional breakfast in that region. Za'atar is wild thyme. And there are two different things that we use the word za'atar for. One is just the word wild thyme. It's a variety of the herb thyme. The other one is a spice mix made with that wild thyme. They take the wild thyme and they add roasted coriander, sesame seeds, and sometimes sumac and sea salt. They blend those all together, and that becomes a spice mix also known as za'atar. And this is becoming more and more popular. So you'll see this in kind of gourmet circles and upscale markets. It's very good for you. And it also has a reputation as being a good cure for coughs. And it's very interesting because, as I said, za'atar is wild thyme. And thyme is known for its cough suppressant properties. And if you look at a modern cough suppressant bottle, you will see thymol, T-Y-M-O-L, which is a chemical derivative of thyme being used in these cough suppressants. Bread and olives, of course, were in the land since antiquity, wheat being very, very important. The Roman Empire was able to feed the its entire empire on the bread and the wheat that it got from North Africa. And olives were so important since antiquity. Olives became known in the olive branch as a symbol of peace because it took 20 years for that olive root to take hold and to bear fruit. So if you planted an olive tree, you couldn't plant it somewhere where you knew you were going to have to leave next year or next month because it was hostile. You had to plant it in a peaceful area that you thought could be around for a while. So that's why the olive branch became a symbol of peace. Now, there are a lot of innovations taking place in antiquity, especially we have a lot of evidence coming from ancient Egypt. And they were jars that were found in tombs from the first dynasty, which is about 3200 to 2700 BC, which revealed forms of ancient cheese, very, very similar to modern feta cheese. Now, in our modern culinary gourmand lexicon and legislation, the only people who can call feta feta are the Greeks. But it was present in ancient Egypt since 3200 BC. And Old Kingdom tomb scenes also show bread being shaped and baked in mass quantities. They had very, very advanced, what we would consider technology, kind of like our modern bakeries. And they had two different levels. They had one that they would use for the commoners and another one that they would use for the pharaohs. The commoners had very kind of rough, coarse wheat, similar to what our modern bran would be. And they sweetened it with honey and with molasses. And those were their daily breads. And the upper class, like the pharaohs, they had more refined wheat, very similar to our white flour that we use nowadays, and they had sugar, which they recently had gotten from the Persians. So they had cakes and pastries that were light years ahead of what they had in Europe at the time. Bread was very, very important to the ancient Egyptians. It was so important that the Greeks called them the bread eaters. Even today, the modern word for bread in Egypt is aish, which comes from the word to live or life itself. So it's very, very important. And in antiquity, the pyramid laborers were rationed 5 pounds of bread per person per day. So for those of you who are proponents of the Atkins diet, I challenge you a little bit because you've all seen those pictures. You've seen how thin the pyramid laborers were, and they were eating 5 pounds of bread a day a person. So bread is not to blame. And also, our modern day birthday cake idea, this comes from the time of the ancient Egyptians, the time of the pharaohs, because every year on the pharaoh's birthday, he was given a seasoned bun as a means of celebrating his birthday. So over the years, a yearly tradition, something to do with bread fusing with cake, and we have our modern birthday cake tradition. Now, there's also a famous dish called sadeleya that's been around since antiquity. And this is a dish that is like a feminine fisherman type of a dish. They would say that the fisherman's wife would make this dish. And it's a wonderful spice dish. If any of you are familiar with Indian biryani, it's kind of what you would consider to be a fish biryani that's made with a layered rice and turmeric and wonderful blend of spices and also some freshly caught fish. This is a dish that you can find everywhere from Lebanon in the Levant region over into the Arabian Peninsula and into Egypt. Now, the Phoenicians came into power in about 2500 to 3000 BC, and they were also one of those groups that kind of combined and really unified the cuisine of the Mediterranean at the time, because the Phoenicians would go back and forth from the Levant all the way over to what is now France and Morocco. And they would go back and forth. And their trading vessels carried a lot of food with them. And we know a lot about what was going on in this time period from what we found in the Phoenician trading vessels. And they actually found something which is very gourmet, very contemporary and current, aioli. If any of you like Spanish food or Southern French food and you eat the aioli sauce, the A-I-O-L-I, which is that garlic kind of a sauce, this was found on the Phoenician trading ships all the way back then. We talked a little bit about Morocco and the Amazigh culture, the local indigenous culture that referred to themselves as the free people. They were also in Morocco since the 2nd millennia BC. And some of our famous figures in history, like St. Augustine, Ramses the Great, Ibn Battuta, and even the French soccer player Azzedine Alea, have their roots in the Amazighs. Many of the culinary traditions that we know from modern-day Morocco that we think probably are a little bit more recent or had to do with Arabs or had to do with French were not. They were already there with the Amazighs since antiquity. We could see a woman dressed in the traditional costume, and then we see couscous and some local country bread and some of the tagines. Couscous was invented by the Amazighs. It was not interpreted later on by the Arabs. Many of the European traditions say that the couscous was brought with the Arabs, but it was around earlier. What they used to do was they would take the semolina, which semolina is the heart of the wheat germ. So if you take a piece of wheat, you strip away the outer bran and the germ layers, and you get to the center, you have this nice little yellow thing called the heart of wheat. That's semolina. If you take that ground semolina and mix it with water and salt, you can make a pasta out of it. And they would take that pasta and they would put it through some sieves to make it very little round balls out of it. And they did that in a series of 3, so that every time they pushed it through a different sieve, it would get finer and finer, until we eventually have the modern day couscous. And this name that we call couscous actually comes from an Amazigh word, comes from kseksu, which is the sound that the couscous made when it was being shaken back and forth, the pasta in the sieve. So that's how we know it was attributed with them. And the tagine, we see this wonderful clay earthenware pot with the conical shaped lid. The conical shaped lid is only in Morocco, but they do have the bottom portion everywhere else in the Arab world, and especially in North Africa. In other countries, they're called tagines or tagines, but in Morocco, the tagine, and we use the conical shaped lid. This conical shape was very, very important to the people of Morocco because it symbolized fertility. It was shaped like a beehive. It was also shaped like a natural dune that you might see in the sand. So it symbolized prosperity, fertility, all of those wonderful things. And you can see that cone shape that was played out over and over again in pastries, which led to the European cone-shaped pastries. We saw it in the people's dress when they have the hoods on their robes that are shaped like a wonderful cone in the back, and we also have the tagines shaped that way. Now, the ancient Egyptian empire spread all the way from modern-day Sudan all the way into Lebanon. So a lot of the ideas and things that were going on in ancient Egypt got spread out into the world before we even knew Egypt as it was today. And many of the things that we think come from other countries were actually originally ancient Egyptian. One of the reasons why ancient Egypt was so wealthy was because of its abundance of lentils. Lentils were worth more than gold in antiquity, and they were traded. Egypt was the primary producer of lentils, and they were traded all around the world. And still today, in a lot of Mediterranean countries, lentils are used to symbolize wealth. Even in Italy, people eat lentils on New Year's Day as a good luck and kind of wishing that you'll have prosperity for the year, just like we do black-eyed peas in the United States in the South. And it's not just because they look like little coins, it's actually because they were literally worth their weight in gold. Spices were very, very plentiful in ancient Egypt, and this is another reason why they were so wealthy. Many, many of these empires in the Mediterranean were built upon culinary ingredients. Spices were used in embalming in 3000 BC. Hatshepsut, who was Egypt's first and only female pharaoh, actually imported spices from the land of Punt, which is said to be modern-day Ethiopia, Eritrea area. She would bring them in, and this was about 1500 BC. And by 80 BC, there were so many different spices coming into the Alexandria port of Egypt that they actually named a gate for it, and there was a gate called the Pepper Gate, which was where all the pepper was brought into. Crops were very, very plentiful in ancient Egypt. Ful madamis, which is the ancient Egyptian bean, which is a variety of a fava bean, is known to be the world's oldest agricultural crop. Date palms were growing there for 5,000 years. Peas, lettuce, cucumbers, figs, pomegranates, peas, grapes, all of these were abundant in ancient Egypt. And one of the reasons why ancient Egypt had so many crops is because the Nile used to flood naturally 2 times a year. So they really didn't need to have a lot of sophisticated irrigation because the Nile automatically did that. What this ability of the Nile to do was really spawn an idea of celebration around food and spawn Nile festivals, this idea of celebrating around food and having festivals and giving thanks to the Nile, which later on fused with the monotheistic faiths and kept cuisine as the central role of different festivities in Egypt. Now, Judaism also played a role in ancient Egyptian cuisine, and as we know, the Jews were present in Egypt since biblical times, and by about 12th century AD, there were about 80,000 different Jews living in the country of Egypt. Many Spanish Jews found a safe haven in Alexandria after the Inquisition in Spain, and many well-known Egyptian figures were of Jewish descent. For example, Saladin's main physician, Maimonides, was Jewish. Now, the concept of nourishment in the afterlife that the pharaohs had and that the ancient Egyptians had was also introduced into the Jewish tradition, which is very, very interesting because people don't really talk about this. We know about them being 2 separate groups, but we don't know what their interactions really were together. But we do know, this is an example, and I apologize for the glare. I took that from the Agriculture Museum in Cairo. But there is an example of mortuary offering bread that was offered by the Jews to God and placed in their tombs when their members of their community died. So what we can see is they took from this idea, like the ancient Egyptians had of giving offerings, but they used it within their monotheistic faith. Now the Persians came to Egypt in the 6th century BC, and what they did was they introduced the sugar crop. They also introduced walnuts, basil, coriander, spread more pomegranates, pistachios, sesame seeds, and roses. And a lot of the elaborate kind of silverware that was already in use in Persia started becoming commonplace in Egypt. And this did not take place in Europe for many, many centuries following. So this was very advanced. The Greeks also came into power. And when the Greeks came into power in Egypt, it was very interesting because they did not come. In about 525 BC, they were welcomed into Egypt by one of the kings. And he also built them a town on the Nile called Naucratis. He liked them so much that he invited them in. The Greeks didn't come to conquer. The Greeks came to assimilate. They fused their religious styles, they fused their styles of dress, their ways of celebrating, dancing, their languages, everything, to the point that modern Egyptologists really have a hard time figuring out what was Greek and what was Egyptian, because they completely fused their styles. A lot of what we know as Greek that came to this country with the Greek immigrants in the 1800s and the 1900s, like moussaka and these kind of dishes, have their roots in Egypt. But they were brought to us by the Greeks, so we know them that way. So they're very important in both communities, but it depends upon who introduced them to you as to what you associate them with. And then when the Romans came, much later in about 41 AD, they did come to conquer. As I mentioned earlier, they came for the wheat, and they really wanted to use that wheat and to be able to supply it and feed their entire Roman Empire, which they did. And because of the Romans, also Christianity was introduced. We talked a little bit about incense and how much that was important and valued by the ancient Romans. Rome imported 2,800 tons of frankincense and 550 tons of myrrh into their empire from the Arabian Peninsula per year. And the Roman Emperor Nero is said to have spent $100,000 for incense for his wife's funeral. And the type of incense that he bought was frankincense. It was not myrrh, which is very, very interesting, because I mentioned before, frankincense is kind of a mood enhancer. So the rumor around Rome was that he wasn't too happy with his wife. And then she passes away, and then he spends all of this money on something which enhances your mood. So many people use this to prove that he was kind of creating a party-like atmosphere after his wife passed away. But frankincense and myrrh were so important that people called themselves that. Instead of calling them sweetie or my love, they would call each other my frankincense or my myrrh. Now, grape harvest and wine was very, very important in ancient Egypt also. And the western desert region, which we know where the oasis Siwa is nowadays that faces Libya, was actually a very important wine-producing center. And it's hard to think of that, well, it's a desert. How would they produce great wine? Well, 5,000 years ago, it wasn't a desert. It was very fertile, and it was a lush oasis, which they got wonderful wine from. So these climatic changes kind of changed, but it's important to note that the ancient Greeks and the Romans really prized the ancient Egyptian wine. Ancient Egyptian recipes were prevalent in Rome. We can see here over on the right, this is the cover of a cookbook. It's the first cookbook ever known to become into print by somebody named Apicius. That name is spelled Apicius. He was a Roman philosopher known to be the father of all gourmands. There are restaurants and cooking schools named after him all over the world. He was a philosopher, but he loved food, so he wrote the first cookbook. And in it, he mentions things like shrimp that were gotten off the coast of Libya, and Alexandrian bread, and Numidian chicken. Now, Numidia was an area known as what I just defined, the Maghreb. That Maghreb region of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, that was known by the ancient Romans as Numidia or Numidia quadrata, which meant square Numidia. And they used this region to get a lot of food from. And Apicius has a recipe for Numidian chicken in his recipe. If you ever go to Rome and you're on the metro station, taking the metro, one of the last stops in one of the directions towards Cinecittà is actually called Numidia Quadrata, so you can see that nowadays too. And this is the bust of Apicius. But he loved food so much that he wanted to send these fleets out and enjoy the same foods that the emperors did, but he couldn't because he was just a poor philosopher, so he went bankrupt. Well, then when he went bankrupt, he became devastated because he knew he couldn't afford very much more food. So then he actually committed suicide. So it's a tragic story, but we have a lot to learn, and we know a lot of what happened in antiquity because of Apicius. Then in the 4th century, when Byzantium really took hold, now as I mentioned before, the Romans came into Egypt in 41 AD, and this is when Christianity was introduced into Egypt by ways of the Eastern Orthodox religion. 395, the church is split, the Eastern and Western religions, but Christianity was really taking hold, especially in this time by the Levant region. And the role of Christianity was very important in the cuisine of the Middle East, because this is what set the ideas of fasting. And fasting in the Christian tradition, especially in the Middle East, meant that you abstain from meat during holy days and dairy products. So people in the region became vegans for their holy days. And I just mentioned how the Bedouins really prized meat. If you're a welcome guest, you get a lot of meat. Meat's very important, symbol of hospitality. Now, if you're a meat lover, and all of a sudden you've adopted this religion, which tells you have to be vegan for many days of the year, because you have the 55-day fasting calendar for Lent, and then you have 15 days before the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, Wednesdays and Fridays throughout the year, many different holidays. What are you going to do? So you had to become very creative with what you could do with the recipes that you had and turn those into worthy recipes that were meatless. So I tell people, if you're vegan, if you're vegetarian, look towards these old Christian recipes that come from the Levant and come from the Egyptian Coptic community, because you'll find wonderful flavor, lots of protein, and things that you can enjoy within your diet. We see things here like fatayr or sambusik, which normally, this is up in the top left, those are the little triangles. Normally those would have been stuffed with cheese or meat. Fasting times, they're stuffed with spinach and onions and herbs or pumpkin. We see grape leaves over on the right. Again, normally maybe they have some meat stuffing in them or some made with meat broth. Fasting times, no, you would do them strictly with rice and with a lot of different herbs and spices to give you that flavor and to make up for the meat. And then you see a casserole down on the bottom right. This is an eggplant chickpea casserole. It's a wonderful, delicious recipe, very hearty, no meat. And then we have over here kibbe, which are traditionally made, these are balls that are made with this stuffed bulgur wheat, which is a variety of cracked wheat, and they usually have meat inside of them and pine nuts. But during the Lenten season or during fasting times, we'll see them again stuffed with pumpkin. Here we have over on the right something called tameya, which tameya is the Egyptian falafel. It's different from other falafels because it's made with fava beans instead of chickpeas. And this was invented by the Egyptian Christian community as a meat substitute. And it's full of protein. It's got like the highest protein of any other vegetarian dish. You have down here on the bottom left something called fatir, which is a very wonderful homemade puff pastry type of a dish, which you can still get. Sometimes they call them Egyptian pancakes. Wonderful, wonderful homemade pastry that you can get in Egypt, stuffed with many different things. But for Lent, they'll stuff them specifically with vegetarian. And you can even go to some cafeterias in Cairo nowadays, and they'll offer them, and they'll have in parentheses, for fasting Christians. The reason why they put that in parentheses instead of just leaving it vegetarian is because maybe the everyday average Egyptian might wonder, okay, why are you offering me something that doesn't have meat in it? So they have to go the extra mile and explain they're doing that for Christians. People don't think they're crazy for not offering meat. And then you have the vegetable kebabs. Now in the 7th century AD, the Umayyads came into power. And this group was very, very important in the Arab world because this was the first caliphate that ruled after the Prophet Muhammad, after the advent of Islam. And as the religion was being spread, so were the ideas of cities, and so were the ideas that the Umayyads had for commerce. A lot of spice trading, again, a lot of commerce going on. And the Umayyads are what took the village dwellers and started building the cities. They built the cities up around commerce. And it was very difficult for people who were used to living in the village and used to a simple life to go and make that transition into the modern city life. But when we see these very early ideas of Islamic art and Islamic architecture, a lot of them were coming from the Umayyads. Some of their palatial cuisine trickled down into the everyday masses. And we can find some recipes with 13th century manuscripts that were coming from the Umayyads. And this is a picture from Damascus, Syria, which is where they were based. This is a wonderful poem. It was written by a Christian poet, female, and she was also the wife of the Umayyad Caliph Yazid I. And I love this because it evokes all of the emotions of somebody who was used to living in the country and had to move to the city and was not used to cities. It says, "A tent buffeted by the winds is dearer to me than a magnificent palace. It pleases me to put on a cloak of coarse wool. If the eye be watchful, and I no longer find pleasure in wearing transparent fabrics." So again, country people wearing the wool, city people wearing the transparent, silky fabrics. "The restless howl of the winds is dearer to me than the beating of drums," because you had the music and the viceroys in the city in terms of in the country just having the wind. "A dog that snarls at distant passers-by is dearer to me than a cat that creeps along the walls. In the tent, I prefer to have under my teeth coarse bread rather than white bread. I want only my land, which alone in my eyes is noble." Here are some more of the Umayyad influences, some of the spice markets that were set up around the world, and we have the 15th century bazaar from Egypt, Khar Khalili, which was built to house 7 centuries later all of that trade that the Umayyads brought into the area. 7th century, we also see a lot of religious ideology going into the idea of health and traditional medicinals. Many indigenous local communities had the ideas of different foods being helpful for them, and they used food as a medicine in antiquity. But after the advent of Islam, we see the Quran declaring that all of those beliefs are true. Honey and its virtues for us, as we know, they're also found in the Torah and in the Bible. Something called the black seed, which is up on the top left. This is a variety of nigella. And this particular variety of nigella was very, very important. And the Prophet Muhammad has a saying to eat this seed because in it there's a cure for everything except for death. So we have everything in the Middle East made out of nigella, from cough syrups to capsules to people just take it like this or eat it on top of special breads. It's very, very commonly used. And we see some different spices and apricots. Apricots is very interesting. A lot of people, if you've ever been to a Muslim country in the Arab world, or if you've been with people who break their fast during Ramadan, you'll see they often break the fast with apricot juice or with an apricot paste. And you think, oh, it just tastes good, tradition, makes you feel good after you fast all day. But actually, the ancient Arabians actually proved that by drinking a mixture of apricot compote and water, it actually prevents dehydration. So you think people haven't fasted from sun up to sundown. This is a perfect thing for them to break their fast with. This is a dish that we have coming from the Levant, especially Jordan, Iraq, Syria, this region, called matluba. And this is literally an upside-down dish. We talked about the mansaf earlier, which is layered with the rice and the lamb and those kind of things. This is a very similar dish, except it's made in a serving dish, and the lamb is put on the bottom, and then the rice and all of the ingredients on top, and then it's inverted onto a platter and served that way. And this is a very traditional ceremonial type dish that dates back all the way from this century. So also the Lomat al-Qadi, or the judge's mouthfuls, or sometimes people just call them mouthfuls. These also date all the way back to the 7th century. These are just puffed, fried dough balls that are topped with either a sweet syrup or with honey. And we know them, and the Greeks call them loukamades. Many different people have them in many different cultures. But we have proof they were in the Arab world from around 7th century. Now, in the 9th and 10th century, we see the Fatimids start coming into power. The Fatimids were a North African Shiite dynasty that come out of the Maghreb around the area of Tunis. They were very, very important for unifying not only the Arab world, but especially the Mediterranean, Southern Europe, and North Africa. They declared Sicily, Palermo, as their capital 50 years before they declared Cairo as their capital. So we see a lot of similarities between southern Italy and North Africa because of the Fatimids, especially around the areas of sweets. We just had the Christmas holiday. Many of you may have eaten those nougat-type candies that they have from Spain, the torrone or the Italian torrone, something like this. These are Fatimid sweets. And they were so important because the Fatimids loved to have what we would nowadays call cross-cultural celebrations. This was part of their way to get people to get along and to gain political power, was to force people who were of different religions to go out and celebrate together. So whether it was a Jewish holiday, Christian holiday, Muslim holiday, if you were in Fatimid territory, lights were strewn up outside, there was music, and it was encouraged that you go out and celebrate together. And a lot of the things that you would do during the time was eat this type of sweets. Well, nowadays, these have become so ingrained in those local cultures that you can go to the Festa of Santa Rosalia in Sicily or the Prophet Muhammad's birthday in Cairo, and you will see these type of pastries on display, these type of sweets, candies I should call them, for both holidays. And people don't really realize what's going on in each other's land or how important these are, but they have been around since that time, and they're a type of ingredient that unifies North Africa and Southern Europe and that shows the importance of the Fatimids. Another important holiday that has a lot of sweets tied to it is the Eid al-Fitr, or the Feast of the Fast Breaking. Now, in Egypt, when the Fatimids were in power, they used to take these cookies, which you can see in the middle here, the white ones with the powdered sugar on them. They would take those cookies, they would stuff them with gold coins, and every year before the end of the Ramadan holiday, people who are following the religion have to pay a certain kind of charity called Zakat al-Fitr, and they give this back to the community, and the money goes to the poor. Well, the Fatimids, because they loved food, they loved celebrations, and they wanted to give back to the poor, they would take these cookies, and they would stuff them with gold coins, and the caliph would have his men go out and distribute those into the poor communities. Nowadays, we still make the cookies, but of course they're not stuffed with gold. There is like a gold kind of filling made out of honey that they stuff them with, and it's to replicate the original gold that they were stuffed with. And this cookie, taking it a step further, is not a Muslim origin or an Arab origin. It's actually ancient Egyptian origin, and it was called the kahk, or cookie, dating all the way back to the ancient Egyptians. So they had it in ancient Egypt. They reinvented it kind of with Islam in the Fatimids, and then it came to be again in modern times. And we see that theme happen over and over again. Antiquity, Fatimids, modern times. And it kind of, these ideas skipped over Christians and they skipped over the early Muslims because a lot of them, if they took place in antiquity, a lot of the early religions were afraid of them. They kind of thought they were pagan type things. They didn't want to do them over. But the Fatimids weren't intimidated by them at all, and they brought them back into being. And this is why we see many of these traditions in modern day Egypt. Now, in the 12th century, this was known as the golden era of the Islamic Empire. And there was so much trading going on with the spices and with the commerce that we see set up all the way from the Middle East into Europe. And this is a coin over on the left that is on exhibit in the Royal Museum of Stockholm, Sweden. So we had proof that even there was trade going on between Scandinavia and the Arabian Peninsula at this time. And some of the proof also shows up in the food. For example, cardamom. Many people who know Swedish food know that cardamom is very important. Well, those of us who maybe not be so familiar with Swedish food but know Indian or Middle Eastern will say, okay, this is an Indian and Middle Eastern ingredient. What are you doing with it all the way in Sweden? This is because these were the times that this 12th century ships would go through and they would introduce these spices, and for some reason, cardamom really, really caught on. And now, there can't be a Christmas or there can't be a holiday in Sweden without a lot of these very Middle Eastern or Eastern type ingredients. We also know a lot what happened in the 12th century from the Abbasid Caliphate because of people like the physician, who's the father of modern medicine, Avicenna, and somebody on the right named Al-Kindi. Al-Kindi was a philosopher who, just like Apicius in ancient Rome, wrote a lot of cookbooks. And we have about 13 of those medieval cookbooks that are still available in the world today that people can look at and get an idea. But the Abbasids really, really saw cuisine as an art form. They were actually also a very educated caliphate, and they promoted education for all classes. They were the first of all the caliphates to say that the military classes, for example, had to be educated. So they really, a lot of their ideas helped to form Islamic thought. They took ancient traditions from the Greeks, Romans, ancient Egyptians, and they fused it with Islamic ideology and with Persian thought to come up with their own brand of thinking. Here's a picture from the Cairo Citadel. And this is very, very important because from the citadel and from its text, we can tell how wealthy Cairo was in the 12th century. During the reign of Sultan al-Nasr Muhammad, for example, out of this citadel came 12,000 tons of food per day. This is an amazing amount of food, even by modern standards, even by national annual standards of a modern company. So to produce 12,000 tons of food a day, very, very difficult. And of course, the citadel was built by Saladin in 1169 AD. The souk became very, very important at this time as a cultural center and as a business center. They were, of course, the predecessors to modern-day malls. And people did everything there from business to socializing to setting up trade routes between different heads of state. This is a quote from Ian Adler's Jewish Travelers, and it's a quote by an Italian rabbi, Michelum, from the city of Volterra. He says, "We arrived in Cairo on Sunday, June 17th, 1481. If I were able to write about its wealth and its people, I swear that all of this book would not be sufficient. I swear that if I were able to put Rome, Venice, Milan, Padua, Florence, and 4 more cities together, they would not equal in wealth and in population half that of Cairo." So we can imagine at this time, these cities were already quite impressive. So this is what the shape Cairo was in 12th century. Then we fast forward a little bit to the 16th century, and the Ottomans come in, and they enhanced the cuisine and the culture a great deal. The Ottomans already had a very vast culinary empire. In Topkapi Palace in Constantinople, for example, they would hire 1,000 chefs at a time. They would employ them all at one time in their kitchens. Each of those 1,000 chefs had 1,000 understudies. So there were all of these people making food every day in the kitchen. And all of those chefs and all of their understudies had to make the same dish for their entire life. So if I was in charge of grape leaves, me and all of my understudies would make only grape leaves until the day we died. So you can imagine all of those people, the tradition kept getting passed down and passed down. This is how we know which traditions were Ottoman and which were not. The Ottomans also came into Arabia during this time. And many countries, like Arabia, didn't have sugar, regular cane sugar, until the Ottomans got there, whereas the Egyptians had it much earlier from the Persians. And we can see some of the Turkish influences on Egyptian cuisine. We have Turkish delight, call it melban in Egypt. We have a lot of the stuffed dishes. This is really, really part of the Turkish repertoire. We also have something called Circassian chicken, which is a wonderful walnut, garlic, bread stock mixed with chicken. In Egypt, they call it sharkaseya. And here we have the Turkish delight over on the right. And in Lebanon, there became known a city that was known just for its sweets called Tripoli, not the Tripoli in Libya, but Tripoli in Lebanon. And this really became famous for sweets, so much so that people would go there and make pilgrimage there just for the sweets. Even in modern times, people that I know from Greece and from Crete will take an hour plane ride over to Tripoli so that they can get sweets and bring them back to Greece with them. Coffee. The origins of coffee is really steeped in the Arab culture and in Arab cuisine. We see that in the Middle Ages in Ethiopia, coffee was already being grown. And the legend has it that one of the shepherds fed a little piece of the coffee bean to his, shall we say, elderly sheep, and noticed that they started jumping, and that this gave them a lot of invigorating qualities. So they started eating it, chewing on it, and then eventually brewing it and drinking it. This was in Ethiopia. Well, one day, some Yemenis were visiting people in Ethiopia, and they tried the coffee, and they really liked it. The particular Yemenis who were over in Ethiopia at the time were Muslim Sufi clerics. So the Sufis, as many of you know, is a mystical rite of Islam. And they would have these night-long ceremonies called zikrs, or remembrance ceremonies. And they needed something to help them stay awake. So they would use the coffee as a stimulant to help them stay awake during their night-long remembrance ceremonies. Well, when they were there, it really, really worked. So they took the coffee and they planted it in Yemen. And you can see kind of all of this the terrain in Yemen, how the mountains are. They're very, very hostile. And they didn't know how well that they would grow. But what happened was the climate was so unique that they had to develop special irrigation in order to make the coffee grow. And the combination of that geography with the special irrigation made the coffee from Yemen have a special chocolate-like consistency, flavor to it. And that's why the Dutch eventually came up with this idea of the coffee from Yemen and Mocha. There was a port very near to where they would get the coffee from called Al Mocha in Yemen. So our idea of Mocha being that chocolate coffee colored flavor, that's why, because the coffee itself really has almost that kind of a characteristic to it. So the coffee did very, very well with the Yemenis in Yemen, and they liked it, and they used it in their little Sufi community for their own personal needs. Well, eventually people in that Sufi community decided to make the pilgrimage to Mecca. They made the Hajj. When they went to Hajj, they took some of the coffee and brought it with them. They gave the coffee to some of their Egyptian brethren, who were also Sufis, brought the coffee back to Egypt. When they brought the coffee back to Egypt, it was introduced there, and it was also used during these night-long remembrance ceremonies. And on the picture of the right is one of the ceremonies that the Sufis have. And this is the Al-Azhar Mosque in Egypt that was built by the Fatimids, and very close to where they would have these ceremonies. So they started drinking the coffee, and everybody liked it. Well, the Turks, the Ottomans were in power at that time, and they said, you know, this is a wonderful drink. It doesn't have to do anything with religion. Anybody can enjoy it. It can be a secular drink. So we're going to take this coffee, and we're going to make it public and let everybody drink it. They took the coffee back to Turkey, hence the term Turkish coffee, and they introduced it to the world as the wine of the Arabs. Why was it called the wine of the Arabs? Well, there's a sacrament of drinking wine in the Christian churches, just like they saw a sacrament of drinking coffee by the Sufis. So they introduced it as the wine of the Arabs. It became very, very common throughout Europe, and this is why we have Turkish coffee, and it becomes so popular today. Many of the European chefs and writers, like Voltaire and Rousseau, really, really felt that the Arabian coffee was better than any other coffee in the world, and that's the one that they chose to drink. And they say that the writings, for example, of Voltaire would never have happened had it not been for the coffee that he enjoyed so much. Then we come forward to the 19th century. We start to see French and British influences, colonialization taking place throughout the Arab world at various places, various times. In Morocco, this brought the tea, because the British needed a place to sell their green tea, and the Eastern Mediterranean was all consumed with the Crimean War. They didn't know who to sell it to. They introduced it to Morocco. The Moroccans loved it. Green tea with mint all of a sudden became the national drink of Morocco. So it's much more recent than you think. That wasn't until 1854. We also see things like Indian dishes, khichdi, which is a dish which is lentils and rice and pasta mixed together, very common in India. Because the British Empire was in India, they brought this dish back with them. This dish became very, very popular in Egypt and goes by the name of kushri, and then in Britain, where it goes by the name of khichdi. So we see these things kind of spreading because of the British Empire. We also see the notion of formal dining and what considered to be formal dining in the West. Many people started adopting this kind of table setting and these types of dining because that's what the people who were in power had at that time. So we see a little bit more Western trends. We also see kind of regenesis of the wineries and the wine growing in the Levant region especially, and where there was Christian communities. The British and the French helped to revive that in the 19th and 20th centuries. And then after, of course, independence, many people, 21st centuries, 20th, got their independence. So we see sort of a nod back into traditional dishes and people really feeling a national pride towards their dishes. Beirut gained a name, a reputation for itself as being the bride of the East. And we see a lot of wonderful cosmopolitan type things coming out of the city of Beirut. Mezze, which many of you know from our local wonderful Lebanese restaurants that we have here in the area, or the tradition of appetizers, this didn't really take a strong hold until the 1920s. And that's because that's when transportation really opened up in the Bekaa Valley. More roads were built, cars were there, the railroads, people taking mass communication back and forth. And all they had when all this transportation went into place was a couple of bars that men used to maybe have stopped at before to get some raki or some anisette type of alcohol drinks. They didn't really have a lot by way of food. But as people were traveling more, they said, okay, we're going to need to start feeding people a little bit more. Their journeys are longer. So they started making some of these little mazza or appetizers. And the tradition grew on because one place would do it, the other place had to outdo, and there was kind of competition. So whoever could offer the best meze really got the best reputation, and this tradition took hold in the Lebanese culinary scene. There's a salad called fatouche, which is very, very popular in the Lebanese tradition. And this comes from the word fatat, which means in Arabic like something that's grown up, like a well-grown girl. So what you're doing is you're taking a salad, which is just plain vegetables, and you're adding bread to it, and you're growing it. You're growing that salad. So that's where the suffix of ush comes from. It's like you're making it better. And they do that a lot in the Levant region. If someone's name is Ali, for example, as a nickname, they might call him Alouche. So they're taking the salad fatta and calling it fatouche. And that's a popular one. Also, many of you know tabbouleh and become very, very popular here now in the States, but it's really something of a cultural rite in Lebanon and enjoyed much more than I think we have the capacity to understand unless we've been there or unless we've had it there. Here's even a song written by a Lebanese singer, and there's a saying. It says, "Here, let yourself go. I'm making you tabbouleh and a cup of coffee, and we shall be in heaven." So, not such an elaborate food, but it has a very special place in people's heart. Damascus, Syria, also became recently known as the cultural capital of the Arab world. Every year they have these titles that they give to different Arab countries in different Arab cities for different reasons. But last year when it was Damascus, they had different reasons. These are some of the food at the Syrian ambassador's residence here in Washington. The oldest alphabet, the oldest song, oldest painting in the world were all discovered in what is now known as modern-day Syria. And recently, the Oriental Institute in Chicago had a lot of things on display. They offered a modern interpretation of the prayer of infertility, which was known to be the world's oldest song. Baghdad was really a center of empirical life at its height. The capital was located near Sedisfan, which was an ancient Persian capital. And the Abbasid Caliphate, just like it took its capital near the ancient Persian, the Abbasid Caliphate that we mentioned in the 12th century really liked to take a lot of culinary inspiration from the Persians. So we started seeing in Baghdad a lot of those sweet and savory mixes that we might not have in other places like Egypt and Libya. Here's an example of a typical Iraqi meal, and you can see again one of the layered dishes with rice and meat on it, and those little white balls on top, those are the desert truffles. I did a whole lecture on desert truffles a couple years ago, and they're really an interesting thing, very similar to the truffles that you find in northern Italy or northern France, except the pedigree and the whole idea behind them is completely different. In the Arab world, they're eaten by the Bedouins, and they're considered to be not so prized as gourmet items as they are in the West. They're considered to be more like a natural medicinal. They can export them, and they sell them for a very high price into the Arabian Peninsula. But for a desert truffle to grow, there has to have been a storm. So you can imagine, storms come like once every 5 years in the desert. So that's when these grow. A storm will happen, thunder will take place, and usually a mark in the sand will occur. And where the mark in the sand is where you can dig and find a desert truffle. And these are white tubular kinds of things that look like potatoes or parsnips. And these are known for curing eye ailments. So if you think about it, you're in the desert, have a sandstorm, what are you going to have? An eye ailment. All of a sudden, up from the sand comes this thing which cures your eye ailment. It's also very good. It has a lot of health benefits, but they're very, very hard to find and very prized. When they're in season, people usually sell them at the marketplaces and export them to the Gulf and eat them this way. Here we see Amman and the fertile Jordan Valley. I apologize, my mouse is, there we go. And here's some modern Egyptian cuisine, which we can see a suburb of modern Cairo today. This is Mohandasin. We see some of the things that have been around for a long time, still in popularity. The kebabs, and this is an interesting dish down on the bottom right. This is called Balah Hisham. Balah Hisham is made from the same pastry that you use to make cream puffs or eclairs, and it's deep fried. And then it's usually stuffed with cream or served with a sweet syrup on top, or both. So this thing that we think is very French, this eclair pastry, is actually something that's been around for a while. Here's some examples of a typical breakfast. As you can see, very hearty compared to European breakfast. Here are some restaurants in urban areas, very, very modern, cosmopolitan, a lot of American and European influences. And a few, just a recap of our modern dishes with Arab roots: Spanish paella, the rice having been introduced into southern Spain in the 9th century via Egypt, so planted, did very well, and it became the modern predecessor to the calasparra rice. Saffron, also introduced from Egypt, where we get from paella. That rice came into the Po Valley of Milan, mixed with the saffron again, and we get risotto. Our modern birthday cakes, and down on the bottom right, biscotti, which all of us know as being an Italian cookie, but were prevalent much, much earlier than that in the North African countries. So I would like to thank all of you for being patient and for giving me your lunch hour, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I had a great time being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sure everyone now is hungry.
I have brought some
Any
sweets.
question, please? Amy was kind enough to bring some samples. We'll pass them here right now. We'll go there, okay.
Does anyone have any questions?
Any question? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
One of my favorite dishes is hummus with tahini.
Okay.
I never hear you mention anything about chickpeas or sesame.
Okay.
Maybe a little bit of a history on that.
Sure.
And also, you can tell us how phyllo dough is prepared.
Sure. Great. Okay. Well, chickpeas were around since antiquity, and there are many different varieties of chickpeas. Our chickpeas are much larger than the one that they use in the Middle East, but they have been there since antiquity, and mashed chickpeas were used very, very frequently. The notion of the tahini comes from the sesame paste, which comes from sesame seeds, obviously. Sesame seeds were around in the Mediterranean region in antiquity, but it was the Persians who really promoted them as a culinary ingredient into ancient Egypt. So looking at about 6th century BCE. And then it was the Arabs who started making the sesame into the tahini paste. And for that reason, you have a lot of these southern European countries where they make chickpea purees, which are wonderful, and they taste great, but that's not hummus bil tahini because they don't have the tahini sauce in it. That came later with the Arabs, the idea of the two mixing together. And what they normally do, even today in restaurants in the Middle East, is they'll make a good tahini sauce, and then they'll take that tahini and mix it with chickpeas to make the hummus bil tahini. Hummus means chickpeas in Arabic. So hummus bil tahini, chickpeas with tahini. And then they'll take the same tahini sauce and mix it with eggplant to make the baba ganoush. And then they'll take the same tahini and serve it by itself or with something else to make a third dish. And that usually comprises like a trilogy of appetizers. So it's a good home tip too. I do that on TV sometimes. Make up one nice tahini sauce and then go ahead and use it for your others. And I have recipes on my website. You're welcome to visit. It's amyriolo.com. You could see the hummus with tahini. You can see other things on there. And your other question was about phyllo dough. Yes, the phyllo dough. Phyllo dough. Okay. Phyllo originally comes from China. These idea of the very, very thin pastries come from China. What we know as the baklava pastry that's used from phyllo dough came through the Armenians. They called baklava bakli helva, which means Lenten sweet. And it originally had 40 layers, one for each of the days of Lent. And it was not so sweet. That when the Turks took over Armenia, they took that recipe and they enhanced it with much more nuts, much more sugar, because they had a lot more money. That became our modern baklava. But it's very easy to make phyllo dough at home. It's time-consuming and it's a little laborious, but it's not difficult. Just flour, a little bit of sugar, a little bit of salt, and water. And you just take a mixture, yeast, you let it rise, you deflate it, you let it rise again, deflate it again, and then you roll it out. And it's really the elbow grease that's the most difficult for making phyllo. I have a new book coming out. It should be out in July. It's going to be called The Cuisine of Karabakh. And this is recipes, memories, and dining traditions from Azerbaijan's cuisine of culture. And they have a wonderful tradition of homemade baklava in Azerbaijan. So I tested a recipe, and I have a homemade baklava recipe. If you email me or want to wait for the book, you'll be happy to share that recipe. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Sure. Again, right. The Silk Road really merits a whole season of lectures on its own, and I did cover quite a bit in this new book that I mentioned from Azerbaijan. The Silk Road did do a lot to bring East and West. Very early on in antiquity, there were two periods in time that had that kind of going back and forth. The Silk Road, and then also the 19th century in transportation. So much happened, we completely discount that, but so much happened with railways in 19th century. I did a lecture for the Textile Museum talking about how foods went all the way from Africa into Asia because of the railroad. So that's very, very important, because as those modes of transportation opened up, so did food and so did things. And the Silk Road, yes, very, very important. And to the extent that sometimes it's hard, again, when you deal with the Silk Road, to know which country it was, because countries back then, especially the Caucasus, were being thrown back and forth from the Turks and the Persians and the Turks. So it's the more into it you get, the more specific you can find out which things come from it. Very important part of history. Thank you. Yes, Eve.
Well, one thing I question. I recently visited San Francisco, and I didn't realize San Francisco had a Yemeni population.
Uh-huh.
And I stayed in a hotel that had a restaurant called Saha, which called itself Arab Fusion. And they did things like mahmoula with tofu,
Mhm.
and they did seafood kibbe. So it's like people are taking like the traditional dishes and kind of turning them into something that matches with the region that they're from. So it's California that has so many like tofu and stuff. But I also like to ask about recently people are talking a lot about argan oil from Morocco.
Mhm.
And is that something that you can eat also, or is it just something that's applied to olive oil?
Sure, those are both great points and questions. What Eve brings up are two things. One is that the idea of Arab fusion cuisine nowadays, and this is something to be on the lookout of, because as we become more and more familiar with these flavors, and as more and more immigrants come to this country, so will there be more of a need and a reason to fuse. In the Middle East already, people are very open, and a lot of Americans who don't travel to the Middle East are surprised at how open people are to foreign concepts, foreign foods, foreign things like this. They're just everywhere, to the point that many people would just as soon have an American meal as their own traditional meal, or definitely incorporate pieces of that. So fusion is all over the place. In the Middle East, it already exists. Now as more people come to the United States, Eve brought up a Yemeni place in California that had some vegetarian tofu dishes and mixed that with Yemeni. That's a great example. I was just at a place yesterday in Falls Church that was Persian/Peruvian, but most of their menu items were Lebanese. So very interesting. Keep being on the lookout. But this is what happened. You know, we think we want things pure because we think that in antiquity it was pure, but as you can see from, you know, what I'm mentioning, it wasn't. They had a harder time going out to get food. They had to send fleets to China, but they did it. And so for us, it's very easy. So this idea of combining things, it's just wonderful, as long as we are able to give, you know, every culture and everything the respect that it deserves. And the second idea that Eve brought up was the argan oil. In Morocco also, there's a lot of fusion cuisine going on. I'm going to Casablanca on February 7th, and I'll be talking about that in my blog. If anyone's interested, you're welcome to follow along. I have a blog called Dining with Diplomats. But the argan oil, this is something that comes from southwestern Morocco, and this grows on trees where there's something called argan nuts. And the little goats jump up on the tree, and they take the nuts and they drop them back down to the ground. And then the women take them and they gather them and they make oil out of them. A lot of very enterprising British, German companies have gone in and created co-ops, slow food friendly co-ops, to get this oil from these argan nuts and produce it in the world. Because it's limited quantity and it's labor intensive, it's very expensive. But it is wonderful. It's wonderful in terms of flavor. You can use it as a culinary ingredient. It's wonderful as a cosmetic. And they have two different grades, one for cosmetics and one for culinary. I like to use the culinary grade as a cosmetic grade because this argan oil, what it's known for with the local community in southern Morocco, just north of Mauritania, is that it helps the chafed skin. So people are in the desert, you know, they have all the sand in it, and it really helps. Well, we're here in Washington in winter with heat and with cold and with all of this stuff that messes up our skin. Argan oil is a dream for your skin. Just take a little bit, put it on your hands, put it on your face, and it's wonderful. It tastes very nutty, very fragrant, and almost a little bit like coffee. So if you have this oil and you put it on salad leaves or you put it over fish that you've just broiled, you do not need anything else. My only word of caution would be don't cook with it. Don't waste it by heating up its flavor and then losing some of that. Just use it raw as kind of like a finishing little oil. It's wonderful. Thank you.
One more question, please.
Role of honey as a sweet.
Okay. Sure. Honey, of course, very, very important as a traditional medicinal first and foremost, and then as a sweetener. Depending on where you are, it was used more or less. Nowadays, in, for example, North Africa and many places in the Levant, sugar has completely taken over as the cheapest, easiest, and most common way of sweetening things. Some places in more traditional Arabian Peninsula, especially Yemen, honey is still very, very prevalent. But as people become more health conscious and more aware, I think that just will follow from the West and maybe go back and start using more honey. One of the things I hope that catches on in the Middle East that people can benefit from is our new slow food movement, our new nod towards health. Those kinds of things will be beneficial to people in the Middle East who are just becoming familiar with fast food and things like that. And your question, sir? Uh-huh. Okay. Yes. Yes. Exactly. Yes. That's funny that you mentioned, my origin is Calabrian. So yes, you're right. Hot sauce, and very, very popular around the Mediterranean. As you know, hot sauce speeds up digestion, and no matter where you put peppers, it seems like they really take hold, and people really think that they're their own. There are places, you know, in Asia that you can go with the hot peppers, Burma, for example, and people swear that they've been there since antiquity, and they haven't. Peppers are a New World item. The majority of them really came from the New World, so post-Columbus, we're talking 16th, 17th, 18th century. That's a great example of things going westward. They made their way westward, and they became very, very important because of the hot climate, because they grow so easily. They did take on their own flavor no matter where you go. And people will have them. They use it as a garnish for couscous. They use it as a garnish for kushreen pasta dishes in Egypt or kebabs, and wonderful, wonderful condiments. What's in the region of southern Italy where my family's from, it's so important which hot pepper that you have that people grow their own, they dry them, they grind their own, and then the old men carry little packets of it with them, because God forbid if they have to eat outside of their home, they're going to sprinkle their own chili peppers on top, not someone else. You know, it's very, very funny, but those peppers and tomato sauce are very personal to people, no matter where they're from.
Now we invite you to see you up at Amy Riolo.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.